What I'm going to use this lecture to do is talk about new imperialism. So we see this European expansion into Africa, into Southeast Asia, and we also see Russian expansion. We're going to see, as part of new imperialism, Japan start exacting tribute and taking possessions of its own. We also associate new imperialism with U.S. intervention in the Caribbean and the annexation of Hawaii. So we have this relationship with these imperialist, industrialized powers and the places they are going into to establish either spheres of influence or else outright colonies. So we're using our example of Africa to look at this system of new imperialism. So new imperialism is this partition of the world by industrialized powers. Generally, the dates are 1870 to 1914, although if you want to include Hawaii and perhaps some intervention in the Caribbean or Latin America, you might look back as early as 1850 for new imperialism. And India, too, you need to look back to the 1850s. So there are certain changes that prompt what's known as the scramble for Africa. Well, we do have changing technologies, we've got changing dynamics when it comes to economies and geopolitics, we've got the influence of missionaries, and then we also have an entire slide where I'll explain the so-called civilizing mission. So for technologies of engineering, you see the big thing is going to be iron steamships. We have coal-burning boilers on smaller boats that allow boats to go farther inland than they had previously. You also have things like dredging, which you wouldn't think of normally, but now that can be done with steam-powered machines, so it's a lot easier to create ports. So certain technologies of engineering help European powers make further inroads in Africa. We've also got medication, and the biggest one here is going to be quinine. So previously, malaria had killed large numbers of European explorers, and now at least there's some protection against death from malaria. You can drink your gin and tonic every evening and get some protection. We also have technologies of destruction. The best known were the hand-cranked and then the fully automatic Gatling gun, which were introduced in the 1880s. These allow Europeans to rapidly fire from a distance at people who try to resist European rule, and they could also lie then undetected far away. You didn't have as much hand-to-hand combat and thus not as high European casualties, although the effects of the Gatling gun on African populations were quite devastating. As far as economics go, we've got a couple different forces that we should mention. We've got industrialization in Europe, and if we are comparing other new imperial holdings in the US and Japan and Russia as well. And the effects here is that these states were looking for new sources of raw materials for their industrial processes, and sometimes even things that you might not associate, like palm oil, which was used as an industrial lubricant, is something that they were on the search for. And a lot of these things, these raw materials, come from tropical locations. Also, we've got anti-imperialists who point out, people who are against imperialism, who point out that Europeans, Americans were searching for new markets to sell their industrialized products, that if they hadn't had these new markets, that the working classes of Europe wouldn't have been able to buy enough to support the industrialization of Europe themselves. So we have these factory owners who are looking for new places to sell their cheap stuff. Geopolitics and nationalism. What you should keep in mind here is that some of the areas that European powers claimed were not all that rich in resources, but just having this new chunk of land to add to your territory and call your empire could increase your prestige in Europe. So one example might be Belgium, which in and of itself is not a very large and wasn't in the 1870s a very powerful European country, but it established this colonial holding which was thousands of square miles in the Congo, which gave it a leg up when it came to European power dynamics. Another example is that France actually occupied thousands of square miles of the Sahara Desert. That also gives it some prestige, but some of these land claims were actually made to protect other areas that they thought were very important. So that Sahara Desert chunk of land was supposed to help France protect its interest in Algeria, which was a settler colony. We also have the impact of missionaries, and a lot of these men and women, really thought it was their duty to go and spread Christianity, and also they engaged in trying to stop certain inhumane practices like the slave trade. And probably the most famous one is down there on the corner of the slide, David Livingstone. You'll see him in the picture. Now, Europeans in the 19th century claimed that it was their mission, their duty, to quote-unquote civilize non-Europeans. And it was based on an inherently racist model that was a corruption of Darwin's ideas about evolution. And the model they were using, that European anthropologists in the 19th century came up with, put Europeans at the top of the evolutionary ladder and put other races below them. So the idea was that Europeans had to go out and civilize and bring their more evolved ways of life to the masses everywhere else. It was this corruption of the idea of Darwin, it's social Darwinism, which was arguing that Europeans were industrialized and modernized and urbanized more than any other place in the world, which of course wasn't true, but that was the idea behind it. And it explained their supposed alleged modernity and industrialization and superiority by saying they were the most evolved, they were the fittest race in the world. We also see the influence of mass journalism. So you can connect this to changes in leisure and changes in consumption with the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. So we start to see a middle class in Europe and in the Americas, and they've got some excess money that they can devote to buying newspapers and buying magazines. So in the late 1800s, we really have a market for what our adventurers over in Africa were writing about. We have Europeans and Americans who were eager to read about the adventures in distant places that were filled with stories of exotic animals and seemingly different cultural practices. And the newspapers and also publishers actually competed for readership. They would hire reporters to search the globe for stories and report back on all of the adventures they had. And one of the most famous here was Henry Stanley, and you've probably heard the quote, Livingstone, I presume. Well, Stanley was the one who was hired to go in 1871 to go find David Livingstone, who'd been lost. No one had heard from him for several years. And Stanley was sent out, and 10 months into his journey alongside Lake Tanganyika in what's today Tanzania, he caught up with Livingstone, and he was reporting back at home, and that was being published in serial form, so people could buy the stories of what Stanley was up to every couple of weeks, and they could finally hear his report of his meeting with Livingstone. And this made Stanley an instant celebrity. That quote, if you're familiar with it, right, still plays an important part of our imaginary thinkings about Africa. And right now you can actually go. You can go as a tourist and take the tour to see where Dr. Livingstone and Stanley met up. There's a mango tree planted there, and you can hire a tour guide who will tell you the story of their famous meeting.